Welcome everyone to Jackson and Josephine's Small Woodlands Association presentation, Early Seral Plant Communities, What They Are and What Role Do They Play in Forests. My name is Jerry Burke and I will be your host. Tonight we'll have a presentation for about an hour and an opportunity midway to pose questions to the presenter. Please write your questions in the chat window where they will be read. Speaker Thomas Stokely is an ecologist by training with a PhD in Forest and Wildlife Ecology from the OSU College of Forestry. As the former OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Agent serving Central Oregon, Thomas provided science-based education to communities on the conservation of forests and the wildlife they support. He worked with individuals, youth, and adult classes and collaborative groups to help support an inclusion learning environment which encourages multiple perspectives on natural resources management. In his new role as forest ecologist with the Nature Conservancy, he provides science support to help inform forest management decisions at local and regional levels, with the focus on cross-boundary partnerships and attaining a balance between ecological, economical, and societal values. Welcome, Thomas.
Thanks, Jerry. And yeah, thanks, Max, for inviting me to come talk to you today. This subject is near and dear to my heart. I've studied early successional plant communities for going on about 12 years now, since I began my journey through my master's, doctorate work, postdoc. Most of it was in the Coast Range of Oregon, and looking at industrial forest plantations and how the management of those plantations affected wildlife and overall biodiversity and ecosystem services provided to humans, including timber production. So this subject is something I care a lot about, and it's something that I've spent a lot of time focused on. So I'm glad that y'all can join me today. I hope I don't confuse you too much when it comes to what these plant communities are in nature. So typically when we talk about early successional plant communities, we're generally talking about post-disturbance, whatever comes back post-disturbance, whether that be something like a volcano or a glacier, or in which we call them pioneer species, or wildfire, which we call them more of this early seral. So there's a lot of different words you can use for these plant communities. You might think of pioneer plant species, early successional vegetation, early seral plant communities, whatever you want to call them. They're typically the disturbance adapted species. And so, here in the Pacific Northwest, our ecosystems are very well familiar with disturbances. This is an artist's rendition of Mount Mazama, or now known as Crater Lake. And that explosion would have just decimated thousands and thousands of acres of forest land and other ecosystems, leaving behind this barren landscape. Not only did it clear out whatever was remaining in that system, it would have spread ash far and wide. So disturbances have multiple effects on the ecosystem, and either altering it directly or indirectly through nutrient inputs that extend throughout these ecosystems. And also in the Pacific Northwest, we're very familiar with the disturbance that is fire. Fire is a very natural part of these forest ecosystems, and it is also something that more and more we're becoming aware of in terms of influencing our society, influencing forest management, the wildland urban interface. And I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with fire, especially following the last few years of wildfire throughout the Pacific Northwest. And there's also a wide variety of other disturbances here in the Pacific Northwest, like snow, for instance, higher in the mountains. Avalanches are a huge disturbance factor that helps to clear these systems of trees and maintaining more of these like shrub communities or herbaceous communities. Also, a lack of moisture can be considered a disturbance when it comes to the overall impact it has on that ecosystem. And of course, there's wind. I'm originally from Missouri, and I've experienced firsthand the effect that wind can have on our family farm. We had 2 tornadoes come through and destroy the stables that I grew up with. But after it still stands, hopefully no more. But there's also a lot of biotic disturbances. We call these any disturbance that's caused by the living organisms are considered biotic disturbance agents. And one thing we're very familiar with is some of these bark beetle species, like this Doug fir beetle. And so they can have a pretty substantial impact on the ecosystem as well, shaping it by removing those overstory tree species. And of course, this is one disturbance agent that I studied throughout my graduate research, wild ungulates, as well as domestic ungulates. But my focus had been on the effect of selective foraging or selective herbivory by deer and elk in the Coast Range, and how that helps shape plant communities in these post-logging environments. And of course, speaking of logging, we also have, us as a biotic disturbance agent, humans. More and more, we've replaced most of the disturbance agents in the landscape through manipulation of forest ecosystems, whether it be logging, the suppression of fire, getting fire back on the landscape with prescribed fire. And for millennia, we had been a disturbance agent. Indigenous communities throughout North America had set fire to many different ecosystems, overall shaping how they function and how those ecosystems develop, how those forest ecosystems develop through time. So what is forest succession? This is something that seems very straightforward, but can get really complicated the further you dig into it. Traditionally speaking, a lot of forest successional models had depicted this sort of change in plant communities following some sort of disturbance, like a logging operation or a wildfire. And you've got these what we have these discrete or distinct stages of forest succession, and typically they start off with this grass forb stage. And I'm actually going to get a laser pointer out so you can see a little bit better. You got these grass forb stage, which is immediately following the given disturbance that would have removed all the overstory tree species, going into a shrubs slash young tree seedling sapling stage. And then as those saplings grew up and replaced a lot of the shrubs, forbs, and grasses, you would have had this more dense pole sapling stage to a young tree stage, in which case during this period you'd have a lot of competition between trees, in which we call sort of that that competitive exclusion stage, or the stage at which you start to have some of those trees that are stressed out from the competition dying. And when those trees die, they start to create a little bit of an opening, allowing for some of these early successional species to start filling back in. And then, what we think of in terms of, forest management throughout the Pacific Northwest, old growth has been at the forefront of our management of federal lands during the last few decades. And so this is essentially what the model, what forest successional model had been developed by Thomas et al. Back in 1979. So a lot of forestry is focused on successional models similar to this one. And then Jerry Franklin had developed this model, and this successional model kind of indicates a little bit of a different story. And it has the same overall premise in that you have this disturbance event, and this successional model is following mixed severity fire, in which case you wouldn't have had the whole stand being replaced, but you'd have had some remnant trees, fire burned through, maybe some of your old growth that was fire resistant due to the thick bark would have persisted. You'd have had that fire also consuming some trees, killing them, creating snags. And then over time, having that maturation of the forest stand through time, snags fall, become coarse down logs, and you have this early old growth stage, mid old growth, late old growth, etc. But many of our fire adapted systems are finding more and more don't necessarily behave in a linear manner like we had used in our models previously. And they kind of neglect to, they neglect the role of fire in maintaining some of these open forest systems where you'd have had a mix of both early successional and late successional species all in one given stand. So this is a model, another successional model that William Platt in 1994 developed. And this model was based on southeastern pine savannas. And here on the right, well, following these arrows down, this is assuming new land, maybe after a volcano or after a glacier event. You have this pioneer seral stage, those first species that came in following a disturbance, and then maturing to have seral stages. So those, early mid successional stages, and then all the way to climax stage. And so this linear model, like you see over here, assumes no major disturbance, right? And a lot of our models of forest succession include more of these standard placing catastrophic disturbances, like a logging operation or like a wildfire, in which case you would have set that system back to a pioneer or early seral stage. So over here, it's more depicting, that traditional successional model. But in these fire adapted forest ecosystems, like we have where I live currently in Central Oregon, and like many of you exist in down in Southwest Oregon, we have historically had chronic disturbances. So those chronic disturbances, like low severity understory fire events, would have maintained these forest ecosystems in what we call a sort of a disclimax stage. And that disclimax stage essentially assumes that the fire is helping to maintain an open understory and also helping to maintain your most fire resistant species like ponderosa pine and like large Douglas fir. So essentially, when it comes to fire adapted ecosystems, it wouldn't have been so clear of a definition between early successional and late successional. It would have been a mix where you have, all these species that are adapted to fire in one stand or a given landscape. And you would have had a mix of the early successional shrub for grass stage, and then some of these mature fire resistant overstory trees. And as I mentioned, much of our forest management activities out there in the landscape follow more of a contemporary management paradigm where we're assuming more of a linear successional model where we're trying to keep fire out. We're wanting those stands to regenerate to more of a closed canopy forest, or at least an even age stand in many cases, so we can get trees to regenerate as rapidly as possible following a disturbance like logging or like a severe wildfire event. And so that really matters when it comes to the management of our forest ecosystems. And as more and more we're learning, it's not necessarily the way these forest landscapes function in a healthy manner in terms of without fire, we have more of this closed canopy dense forest state. We have a lot of ladder fuels building up, and we have a lot of competition going on between trees. So without fire, those stands and some of these landscapes are more susceptible to catastrophic fire events. So we've essentially pushed forests from this fire adapted disclimax stage where fire had mediated the overall forest structure and maintained that open forest state with the herbaceous shrub understory, and moved it more towards this this model of secondary succession where a catastrophic disturbance event comes through, like say the Biscuit Fire, and sets things back to where they're end up going back to that early seral stage without the overstory. So I just want to ask real quick, and feel free to enter your answers in the chat. Which of these species are considered early successional species? Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, red flowering currant, and camas. Feel free to enter your answers in the chat, and we'll see what y'all think. So I'm seeing we've got current camas, current camas, camas. And you can also enter multiple answers here. Doesn't just have to be one. So it doesn't look like I'm getting in very many more answers. Max Bennett, ding, 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 you win the prize. All of the above. These are all considered early successional species. You might think, wait, what? Douglas fir, early succession? It lives to be like hundreds and hundreds of years old. Same thing with ponderosa pine. They get these really complex, decadent states where we think of them as late successional trees because they form those old growth that we're also familiar with. But the truth is that all these species share one thing in common, and is that they thrive in open grown environments, post-disturbance environments. Douglas fir and ponderosa pine are shade intolerant, so they have to have ample sunlight in order to germinate and to grow. And so without a disturbance, essentially we have Douglas fir and ponderosa pine being replaced by species like true fir that are not fire adapted and that can grow in the understory, or for instance, western hemlock. So Douglas fir and ponderosa pine are considered early successional species. Red flowering currant, that species can grow in the understory of some of these, dense forests, but it also thrives in open environments, and it can sprout from, it can coppice sprout from its base. So if a fire comes through or a large herbivore comes through and eats it down to the base, it can end up sprouting back. So it's a very disturbance adapted species, and a really important one too in terms of pollination services. It's one of the first shrubs to flower, so it's really important. And in terms of culturally valued plant species, camas as well. Camas is maintained in these meadow systems by disturbance. And indigenous communities throughout the Pacific Northwest had managed camas fields in the past, whether it be through digging the bulbs, which helped to turn the soil, or using cultural fire to keep these meadow systems open. So all these species here can be considered early successional species. So thanks for all your answers. I'm sorry I had to throw you a trick question to start. So, even though all those forestry models that we think of included this early successional stage of forest development, oftentimes they've been overlooked in terms of the overall value for biodiversity and forest ecosystems. And so a group of these authors back in 2010, when I actually first started my research in this field, they came up with this paper, the forgotten stage of forest succession, early successional ecosystems on forest sites. And essentially these authors wanted to bring attention to the value of these disturbed habitats as sources of biodiversity and forest landscapes, as really highly valuable wildlife habitat. They bring up the importance of them for nutrient cycling and for also biological legacies like snags, which are also important for nutrient cycling and wildlife habitat. And so I'm sure all you are familiar with Dr. Jerry Franklin. He essentially was one of the Gang of Four that helped to draft the Northwest Forest Plan that ended up having such a substantial influence on forest management throughout the Pacific Northwest on federal lands, subsequently affected, all lands essentially over time. But Jerry Franklin, in the past 15 years had also been really bringing more attention to these early successional pre-forests is what he likes to call them, because they don't quite look like or resemble forests unless you're maybe an ant, but brought a lot of attention to the value of early successional plant communities, essentially acknowledging that they played a vital role in forest composition, especially when it comes to these fire adapted ecosystems that would have maintained a state of large, old, fire-resistant trees, and a diverse assemblage of these disturbance-adapted plant species growing in between them, growing in between those large old trees. So why should we care about early seral plant communities? Early seral and early successional, I'm going to use them interchangeably, so I apologize for not being consistent here. But one of the main things is these are disturbance adapted plant species. So many of these plants have evolved traits to withstand a disturbance event. A lot of the broadleaf shrub species can coppice sprout, can sprout out of their basal buds. And so whenever, a fire comes through, or maybe historically a woolly mammoth might have come through and just eaten the whole shrub, they have this ability to rapidly regenerate, rapidly resprout. And you also have some of your herbaceous plants, your grasses, your forbs, your ferns. A lot of those species have either evolved to be dispersed by animals, including shrubs, or dispersed by animals, or dispersed by wind. So the value of that is they can colonize pretty rapidly these post-disturbance environments where there's bare mineral soil and there's a lack of overstory trees, essentially taking advantage of the release of nutrients, the release of sunlight, and the release of moisture. And there's a wide variety of different plants out there in these disturbance adapted plant communities. And some of them have traits to just grow as fast as possible to get above the competition. Some of them are more herbivory tolerant, where they can just deal with large ungulates going through and nipping on them. Some of them have evolved to spread far and wide with the winds. And some of them have adapted to just hang out there and wait until another disturbance comes through so they can rise and shine to the occasion. And interestingly enough, a lot of these post-disturbance environments are some of the most biologically diverse in the Pacific Northwest. When it comes to most of our forests, we don't have an extremely diverse amount of tree species. Y'all are fortunate down in Southwest Oregon to have the most diverse assemblage of conifers in pretty much all of North America, I believe. I'm not exactly sure if that's the case, but I've read that somewhere. But overall, there are many, many more of these broadleaf species, forbs, and grasses. And so these post-disturbance environments end up being major sources of biological diversity, and not only in terms of plant diversity, but also in terms of arthropod diversity, your insects, your arachnids, all your other little tiny critters, as well as songbirds, small mammals, large mammals like deer and elk, bears. They all really rely on some of these disturbance adapted systems so they can acquire forage. They're functionally diverse. As I said, a lot of these plants have evolved traits to fulfill a certain niche in these post-disturbance environments. And as many of you probably know, no two plants can have the same exact niche, but they can compete for resources. And so you have a lot of competition going on in these post-disturbance environments. And so that ends up making them pretty functionally diverse. You have, a lot of pollinators, adapted plants. When I say functionally diverse, I mean those plants have different functions. So some plants might be really important for pollination. Some plants might be really important in forage species. Some plants might help in nutrient cycling by fixing nitrogen into the soil, like in the case of red alder and ceanothus. And some plants, overall just end up helping to stabilize that soil because they rapidly regenerate, like after a fire, and help stabilize the soil after a disturbance event. So what functions do they overall serve? Well, they're the first stage in succession. So that composition of forest early on oftentimes can determine what forests look like in the future. And this ends up influencing the way we manage the forest, because a lot of people consider these things to be brush or species that compete with our conifers. So they can delay succession for sure. And they can also alter the overall density of conifer and mature or and hardwood tree species that regenerate, which ends up altering overall forest composition and forest structure through time. So that early successional state can be really important in terms of determining what a forest looks like hundreds of years from now. As I mentioned, you know, especially in more moist environments that are more productive, they can help to rapidly stabilize the soil. And I think a lot of you witnessed this yourselves. Post fire, you know, it looks terrible and you think, well, that whole slope's going to go if you get a good rain event. But overall, some of these species, especially the ones that are already on site, that were just hanging out there in the understory waiting for an opening, those species end up rapidly colonizing these post-disturbance hill slopes and help to stabilize soil and reduce runoff. As I mentioned, nutrient cycling is a major function in terms of some of the species that help to fix nitrogen, as well as the overall amount of biomass that's being cycled in these systems. And as the forest fills in, you know, a lot of these plants can help to stabilize nutrients, not allowing them to leach off site. And what I'm really interested in is the role for promoting wildlife habitat. As I already mentioned, you know, these ecosystems end up providing a lot of diversity in terms of forage and cover for different wildlife species. And of course, humans, they definitely influence us, and they influence us when it comes to reforestation and our ability to get trees to grow rapidly. In many cases, they end up being a real problem for reforestation. You know, if you see this this disturbed early successional community here, getting trees to grow in this environment is very, very difficult because of the lack of moisture availability. All these plants are competing with each other, and getting conifers to establish in really dense environment, plant communities like this can really hamper reforestation efforts. And that ends up influencing timber revenues. And so if your major objective for your land is to get trees to establish as rapidly as possible, so you can have a return on that investment in terms of the site, and get a merchantable crop of timber within 35, 40 years, yeah, early successional plant communities can really affect timber revenues. We did a bit of research on that I'll share here in a little bit. And of course, non-timber resources. What always struck me as being really fascinating was that a lot of these plants, you know, they had very, very high value for indigenous communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. So a lot of these shrub species, forbs, graminoids, and ferns, and in some cases, they were managing these disturbed habitats to promote traditional forage resources. And, you know, interestingly enough, Europeans come along and it's like, well, we want trees to grow. We really value that timber resource. So it's been a bit of a flip in terms of values for the landscape. And there's probably many functions that we are yet to learn about. And so the more that folks do research on early seral plant communities, the more we end up finding what, you know, we don't know a whole lot about them. And we'll get to that here in a little bit. But so in terms of these functions, I've already mentioned some of the traits, but, you know, as ponderosa pine is an early seral species, it really needs bare mineral soil to germinate the seeds do. And so that's a disturbance adapted trait. It also, through time, develops really thick bark. And that thick bark helps to keep those trees alive, you know, when a wildfire burns through. And that thick bark essentially helps insulate that cambium, that xylem and phloem from the heat, keeping the tree alive during even pretty hot fires. And as I mentioned, a lot of these broadleaf shrubs can rapidly resprout following a disturbance. This is bitter cherry, and I took this picture, I think it was like 3 months after the fire had burned through up in Warm Springs. And it was just fascinating, you know, that these things were already growing like 2 feet tall in dense clumps following a fire that occurred months before. And mind you, these things were able to regenerate in the dry season pretty rapidly. So essentially, this trait helps to also make it a really valuable forage resource for wild ungulates like deer and elk. Because it's growing so fast, it's investing less into chemical defense and more into growth. That means it's putting more of its energy into its carbohydrates. And that makes it much more valuable in terms of nutrition for deer and elk. And deer and elk are summer forage limited in terms of they really rely on these disturbed ecosystems to obtain enough calories in order to put on enough fat reserves to survive the winter and summer. So whenever you think about how to promote your property for deer and elk, for instance, these early successional shrubs are vital to the health of these wild ungulate populations throughout the Pacific Northwest. And in some cases, we're noticing, decline in population, potentially tied to a lack of forage on the landscape. And it's not just deer and elk. A lot of people consider bears to be more of a forested species. And yeah, of course, both deer and elk and bear species really rely on forest. But what's a better environment to find berries in an opening? Speaking of berries, huckleberries. Humans had managed some of these higher elevation huckleberry patches in the Cascades for hundreds and hundreds of years with the use of fire. Huckleberry is another species that can resprout following fire. And interestingly enough, it primarily reproduces vegetatively underground through rhizomes. And so they can persist in the understory for quite a long time, waiting for a disturbance to remove the trees above them. And as already mentioned, pollination services, conifers aren't great. Conifers provide zero value for pollinators unless it's wood, in which some cases some bumblebees will actually lay their eggs in wood. And so, this yarrow, for instance, it's another disturbed habitat species, and that ends up becoming a great value for pollination services. So many think that some of these disturbed environments end up serving as a source habitat for bees and butterflies and moths. And in the case of our native bee species, Oregon has some of the most diverse set of bees in the West. And so in terms of agricultural production, pollinators are really critical. And so having some of these disturbed environments adjacent to agricultural lands can be pretty important as serving as a source for these pollinator populations. And we can't forget the songbirds. We've got the rufous hummingbird and grosbeak, and a lot of these birds that migrate up from the south end up setting up territories in these disturbed areas. Many times it's, well, in the case of the hummingbird, it's to seek out nectar resources that are only provided by forbs and shrubs. In other cases, they're looking for seeds and for some of those, grains and seeds from like grasses and different shrub species, as well as berries. And in other cases, they're insectivorous birds, where these disturbed environments end up providing a lot in the way of insects. And so those insects end up becoming really important forage resources for a variety of different songbirds. And also, some of these disturbed open environments are important for reptiles as well, for them to forage on insects and for, snakes to forage on small mammals. And I don't have any pictures of small mammals, but there are many, many small mammal species that rely on disturbed environments. So I like to recommend these publications if you're interested in what types of species you might find in these disturbed early seral habitats. And one of these papers, this is from my master's advisor, Joan Hagar, and she wrote this paper on wildlife species associated with non-coniferous vegetation in the PNW. And it's a great source. It just essentially has these tables of all the different species you might find that are associated with broadleaf vegetation. And it explains what they key in on, what are the resources they key on. So you also have Mark Swanson from Washington State, who wrote this publication on what he calls pre-forest associates. And then OFRI has all these publications on wildlife and managed forest. And this one's great. This one was kind of followed up on some of the work that my colleagues are doing, and has a whole list of different songbirds that you might find in some of these early seral habitats. Speaking of birds, these are two early successional broadleaf associated species, the orange crown warbler and the rufous hummingbird. And these data are from the breeding bird survey data, where essentially, it's a citizen science approach to collecting data on bird abundances throughout the whole United States. And my my PhD advisor, Matt Betts, came up with these figures, and essentially both the orange crown warbler and the rufous hummingbird, their populations have been steadily declining since the 1970s. And so it's cause for concern. Actually, this reduction in population of the rufous hummingbird was at least more rapid decline than spotted owl at the time. Of course, spotted owl populations are tanking right now, but at the time, the rufous hummingbird decline was, those populations were declining at a more rapid rate than spotted owl. Their populations were more abundant to start with, but it's still cause for concern for these early seral associated species. So we also have throughout many forests and a loss of meadow ecosystems and loss of shrub fields due to the lack of fire in the landscape. And this has major implications for culturally valued plants of whether it be indigenous communities that have been stewards of the land for millennia, since time immemorial, and also for wild foragers. People like to go harvest huckleberries and find value in different medicinal plants. And so with the loss of these meadow disturbance adapted ecosystems and shrub fields in the Cascades and in wetlands throughout the Pacific Northwest, we're also losing really valuable non-timber resources and sources of potentially medicine in the future. We're finding more and more that some of these wild plants have great medicinal value, not just traditional, but modern. So going back in time, this is a picture from, I can't remember what butte this was in Southwest Oregon, but you can see this is all post-fire. Like, this is a shrub field as far as the eye can see. And even when you get into this forest back here, it's pretty open forest. So fire was no stranger to all the Pacific Northwest, but specifically in Southwest Oregon. Of course, Smokey comes along, and I don't need to get into, the role of Smokey the bear in shaping how we treated fire throughout the past century. But I do want to note the irony in photos like this. Deer are an early seral adapted species. They really require open, disturbed environments. Same thing with bear to acquire their forage resources. So I always kind of find these posters ironic. If anything, Smokey and the deer should be a spokes animals for some of these disturbance adapted ecosystems. And fast forwarding to present day, the management to suppress fire has had major implications for forest landscapes. In some cases, that resulted in these catastrophic fires, like the Biscuit Fire and all the variety of different fires that have happened down there in Southwest Oregon. And as well as, the management of private industrial forest land, the management of, non-industrial private forest land as well. Fire has always been at the forefront of the management of our national forests and our private forest lands. And as I mentioned, we're seeing an overall infilling of conifers. Now these sites are reaching carrying capacity. So we're seeing a lot of competition-induced mortality. We're seeing a lot of stress in trees. You can see some of these dying tops of trees. That ends up making them more susceptible to insects and diseases. but we have an overall loss of these shrub fields and open meadows. And I say that, and it's interesting I say that because in the past, 5 years, we were writing papers about the value of early Seral and how we don't have a whole lot of it anymore. And then we have these catastrophic fires that come along. And that really creates a problem because now it's creating a whole ton of early Seral vegetation, but it's not functionally the same as it would have been historically, given lower severity fires, given more frequent fires. So I want to pause just a moment and open it up to questions if anybody has any before we get into more local implications of early Seral vegetation. So yeah, feel free.
Thank you, Thomas. Well, I asked a question after your cultural, you had a slide of plants that have cultural value, and I saw the elephant's head in there, one of my favorite flowers. I'm wondering what the value of that is.
Yeah, I put that one up. Some people think it has medicinal value. It doesn't have, I think in terms of modern medicine, there isn't really much in the way of, the medical professionals considering to have, but I know that a lot of folks have harvested the flowers before they turn to seed, and then they mix them in with their smoking tobacco as sort of a calming, soothing herb. So, it's something that people have smoked in the past, and it doesn't really affect you that much as far as what I've learned. It's just something that people find to have medicinal value. I'm not that kind of doctor, so I can't really say, but there's a wide variety of different Pedicularis species, and it's thought that they have sort of this calming, soothing property.
Thank you. Max asks, diverse early Seral with shrubs is sometimes seen as flammable brush. Thoughts about management for early Seral habitat and reduced fire hazard?
Yeah, I'll get more into that here in a few slides, but you're totally spot on, Max, especially some of these early Seral shrubs that have, a whole lot of phenolic compounds, a whole lot of terpenes, and some species have creosote type compounds, and those end up becoming highly flammable. Manzanita, for instance, those waxy leaves end up becoming very flammable. I was on a prescribed fire down in Southwest Oregon on the Ashland Trex Ashland Prescribed Fire Training Exchange. And yeah, these manzanita would go up and they would essentially torch up into the canopy, resulting in mortality of the trees. So when it comes to reducing fire risk on your property and shrubs, the main thing to consider is not only the species and how flammable they are, and you can get this information online. The Forest Service Fire Effects Information System has a lot of information on flammability of different shrub species. But overall, one thing to really consider is the continuity of these early successional, these shrub species. Anymore, post-fire, we have these large fire perimeters of high severity, and it creates this dense shrub field that's very contiguous, and that serves as, a medium for fire to spread back through and have a reburn, and that can really alter that system and make it much less valuable for wildlife, because you end up favoring some of those flammable species again, like manzanita and ceanothus, where they just regenerate and become a monoculture. So overall, the idea is to break up the continuity in fuels. And so that could include some mastication treatments. That could include, spraying some herbicides in areas to get conifers to regenerate just enough where they can shade out some of the shrubs underneath them. And yeah, overall, when it comes to management, and I'll get into the, more implications for Southwest Oregon, those more mixed severity, low severity understory fires are probably historically had more value in terms of they wouldn't have just been this super hot fire of contiguous fuels that would have just allowed fire to spread throughout the fire shed, but it would have been, patchy fires where you'd have a group of shrubs burning up and then it would burn back down in an herbaceous layer of vegetation and get back down on the back into the understory. So yeah, you're totally right, Max. The overall idea for reducing fire risk when it comes to shrubs is to break up the continuity of fuel so you don't just have a fire burning straight through.
Tom asks if camas would be a good plant to use in stream restoration.
So I know it is more of a moist meadow type adapted plant, and it has, you know, very high value for pollinators, high cultural value. Yeah, I mean, I love the plant, and, you know, it might be good to, if you plan to use it in restoration practices, might be good to consult with some of your local indigenous communities, your local tribes, to see their thoughts on restoration using camas, because it is a sacred food for some tribes. And so, you know, when it comes to that, like, I always think it's good to do your research, and it's good to get multiple perspectives on it before you just go out and start planting it. But overall, you know, it's a species that have been cultivated pre-European, and, you know, essentially it's pretty easy to take a bulb and plant it. And I know that you can buy them from your local native plant nurseries. You can get them from your soil and water conservation districts. It's pretty easy to find camas bulbs for restoration.
Max asks about breeding bird declines, and are they primarily with early seral associates or more generally?
Primarily early seral broadleaf associated species, primarily, yeah. And I can send you some papers on that, Max, if you'd like. But Matt Betts had done quite a bit of research on this, and so, yeah, there's a whole variety of different early seral birds that are on the decline.
Tom asks if or how increasing temperatures affect these preferred plants.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to get into that here in a minute. Yeah, I would say one of the major effects, regardless of the amount of precip, when you have higher temperatures, you have more evaporative and transpiration demand. So in order for those plants to cool down, they have to take up water and transpire it, you know, through their stomata. And the more, with increasing temperatures, you have essentially more of a it's going to be way more moisture limited, these systems. And with that, I would see essentially a transition from some of your drought intolerant species like maples and some moisture limited environments to more drought adapted species like ceanothus and manzanita. So we might be seeing a lot of community changes in favor of more drought tolerant species.
Elisa would like you to talk more about the cause for the decline of the rufous hummingbird and whether it's linked to overbrowsing from deer and elk.
Yeah, I'll get into the deer and elk issue. You know, again, I've done quite a bit of research on that, and I wouldn't say it's due to overpopulation of deer and elk directly, and we can't exactly say what's causing the decline. But overall, my main assumption is that it has a lot to do with how forests have been managed, and a lack of meadow systems, a lack of these diverse early seral shrub fields. Not necessarily like, you know, a ceanothus field, for instance. That is an early seral shrub field, but some of these patches of really diverse early successional plants, losing ribes species, for instance, are really important for rufous hummingbird. And so the conifer centric mindset of really just trying to promote tree regeneration ends up missing out on really valuable plants. And I'll get into the interaction with deer here in a minute, but it could be in some cases, yeah, deer and elk could be driving that by eating eating those flowers. And I've seen some evidence of that. Some researchers that were studying columbine, and columbine is one of those that the hummingbirds really like to get nectar from. And they had these studies trying to plant columbine, and everything they planted just got eaten right away. I've got time for one more, and then I probably got to move on.
Last question. Jeff wants to know if you can distinguish between what's the difference between early seral ecology following massive high intensity fires and the traditional early seral habitat that came from smaller fires set by indigenous folks before Europeans arrived.
Yeah, in some systems, particularly like these open grown ponderosa pine, Doug fir types, where you would have had really frequent fire, like 10-year return interval, that would have been selecting for more like forbs and grasses and some very fire tolerant species. And so you probably would have had also a mosaic where you had a lot more variety of different seral states where, a fire might skip over here and burn, it wouldn't just burn evenly throughout the entire landscape. So you probably would have had a lot more diverse assemblages. I can't say that for sure. There is a lot of survey data that suggests there was a ton of different, shrub fields and meadows higher up in elevation. But with these catastrophic wildfires, they burn so hot and so intensive. A lot of the species that were hanging out there in the understory end up becoming nuked. And so they end up dying, and we end up having more of a homogeneous layer of regenerating plants that are wind dispersed, for instance, or species like Ceanothus and Manzanita that are really adapted to colonize those post-fire environments. And unfortunately, I think the value for these monocultures of Ceanothus and Manzanita and other shrub species that are fill in after those catastrophic fires probably aren't the same value for biodiversity as you would have had historically. It would have been maintained with this more regular cycle of fire.
Thank you.
No problem. Let's see, how much time do I got? How much time should I keep going for? Because
You have half an hour if you like.
Okay, I'll try not to draw this out too much, but as everybody knows, I don't need to get into the politics of the Northwest Forest Plan and the influence it's had on the landscapes, but it definitely had a major influence. Pre Northwest Forest Plan, there was a ton of logging on federal land that would have created a lot of early successional plant communities on federal lands, and you had really high populations of deer in many of these areas that were logged over because of the available forage. Post Northwest Forest Plan, you had a lot of infilling of forests, a lack of all those, logged over areas, especially the ones that were replanted, come back as, dense conifers with little value in terms of understory plant diversity. And when we look over here, and for some reason my laser pointer went away. There we go. Down here in Jackson, Josephine counties, this is the Northwest Forest Plan fire regimes they had mapped out. And this red is very frequent, low severity fire. So wouldn't have been these vast shrub fields that I was mentioning as like, what you get post-catastrophic fire, would have been more of a mosaic of fine scale variability with large fire adapted, tree species with that early seral vegetation in the understory, in those openings and in those thinned out stands. So these are, this is from Carrie Metlin with the Nature Conservancy, had given me these photos and slides. And these are some, this is a fire scar. And essentially, dendrochronologists have gone through, fire ecologists have gone through and try to reconstruct what fire history would have been out there in the landscapes. And Southwest Oregon, as I showed you on that map, would have been fairly frequent. And you can see this, that was burning like about every 10 years, every 10, 11 years, you would have a fire burn through. And if you can think back to Fire Ecology 101, the fire behavior triangle, which is looking at fuels, topography, and weather being the major three determinants of fire behavior. We always have drought in the summertime. It's always dry and warm in the summertime. We have productive enough ecosystems where vegetation regenerates pretty rapidly post-fire. And then we have the right topography in many areas to allow fire to burn through the landscape. So in many cases, we would have had pretty widespread fire events, but they wouldn't have been burning very hot because there's not enough fuel loading in the understory to transmit that fire up into the overstory. And so, as I mentioned, that would have created more of this fine scale variability and more of a fire adapted ecosystem. So I don't necessarily need to get into all the details of this, but this is a paper by Ben Phelan and my old advisor, Matt Betts, looking at late old growth forest versus early successional forest. Here on the left is old growth, here on the right is early successional, and this is overall amount of forest area and old growth versus early successional. And as you see here, this is the federal line, pretty stagnant post Northwest Forest Plan. There's not been a whole lot of change in old growth, except for during fire events that would, go through and have a catastrophic fire. But we do see, overall decline on both federal and private industrial forest lands, a decline in those early successional plant communities. And the metrics that these authors used for early successional was mean tree diameter of less than 10 centimeters, so pretty small trees, and then over 20% hardwood basal area is what they determined to be early successional vegetation. So, as I've been going through my research, it's like, yeah, we don't have a whole lot of this, but then 2020 happened and, Labor Day fires happened, and it's like, crap, now we have a ton of it in different landscapes. And it's not necessarily how we wanted to have early Seral, but we've got more of it now, and we expect to have more of it into the future with these fire events. And many folks are concerned that that's going to result in some non-forested, some areas staying non-forest. So historically, we had way more non-forest that are now forest. And in the future, it's possible we're going to have way more of the forest area we have is going to be converted to non-forest due to catastrophic fire. And so the piece that I had really focused on was industrial forest management, or what we were calling intensive forest management. And essentially, as many of you know, a lot of forest industry, the major objective is to increase revenues. And the main way you do that is to get a rotation of, even aged, predictably stocked conifer trees that are merchantable by age 40 years, 50 years, 30 years, in some cases, years old. And how you do that, you might pile and burn some of your slash, and then use a variety of different herbicides, pre-emergent and post-emergent herbicides, to reduce the overall density of those shrub and forb and grass species, so you can get those trees in a free to grow state. And for private industrial and private non-industrial forest lands, if any of you, and I'm sure a lot of you here in the audience, do forest harvesting operations, when you do that, you have to ensure that you have a well-stocked stand of trees up to 3 to 5 years post-harvest. So one of the main ways to do that is use of herbicides. It's really difficult to go through and mechanically treat these areas because of the topography, because of the density of vegetation slash. It's just cost prohibitive. So herbicides are oftentimes the main way in which we can reduce the amount of shrub vegetation and get trees to grow as fast as possible. So we wanted to know how that influenced the biodiversity and ecological functioning of these disturbed habitats. How do herbicides influence, deer and elk and shrub diversity, songbirds, variety of different metrics we wanted to look at. So we established this experiment throughout the Oregon Coast Range, and we had these 8 distinct study blocks in a randomized complete block method. That's a statistical jargon for we did our best to remove our bias and to control all the environmental constraints that would have influenced our results. So we had 4 clear cuts. The green is left alone, not sprayed. Blue was just our what we call light herbicide treatment. That just included, it did not include a site preparation treatment. It only included a post-planting herbaceous release and a shrub release treatment. We have this moderate herbicide treatment, which include a site preparation spray, a post-planting herbaceous spray, and a shrub spray. And then we have this intensive, the red, and that was what we would, kind of consider like the Newcomb death spray, where we had repeated entries of both herbaceous and shrub sprays following the site prep treatment. So really limiting the ability of shrubs and herbs to reproduce. And all these stands are planted in the year 2011. So we wanted to look at increasing management intensity from no spraying to heavy spraying and how that directly influenced, tree and shrub regeneration and forb and graminoid or grasses and sedges and rushes. And really wanted to know how that indirectly influenced a variety of taxa, including moths, a variety of different arthropods, so insects, mollusks, arachnids, wild ungulates, pollinators, and also the pollination services, and songbirds, as well as the arthropods that they eat. And overall, we just collected tons of data. We had 140,000 detections of different organisms, over 835 taxa. So a lot of different species. We weren't able to get everything to species level, obviously, especially with the insects, because it's very hard, but did our best. And I'm going to show you these graphs and just try not to look at them too in depth. This is a paper we just published. I'm going to try to show you the overall theme. So just looking at these pictures, this is what it looked like 6 years post planting. So without herbicides, you can tell it comes back as a really diverse and dense, really productive variety of shrubs, primarily shrubs and forbs. And then as you increase in that herbicide treatment, this didn't receive a site prep, but you can see those trees that were at least not growing right next to a shrub were able to get above some of the herbaceous vegetation, some of the shrubs. And then with moderate amounts of herbicides, this moderate amount is actually more of an industrial standard. That's a site prep with follow-up herbaceous treatment. And we did woody treatments of maple where needed. And you can see clearly more conifer generation. And on the bottom, you've got this, that intensive spray where it's like really heavy stocking, very little mortality of the tree seedlings, and high production of crop trees. And the green here is the control. These values overall indicate how good they were at producing a given metric. So we've got bird species richness, pollinator richness, floral resources for pollinators, culturally valued plants, meaning plants that have value as either food or medicine for humans or the floral industry, native plant species richness, ungulate forage. So those controls are really good at producing all these plant related and insect related metrics. And versus the moderate and intensive spray really didn't do as well in producing those different biodiversity metrics. And overall, even though we found less ungulate forage as you increase your herbicide spray, we did find very little evidence that it influenced the actual observations of wild ungulates via camera trapping. But when it comes to revenues and timber production, carbon, overall, the moderate and intensive and even light treatments did a really good job at growing trees. And that kind of goes without saying. That was to be predicted. In these other metrics, we didn't find much evidence of an effect. So overall, without spraying, we produce a whole lot of these native plant species and different values like floral resources and culturally valued plants, and then even benefited bird species richness, pollinator richness, and forage. And these lines, again, don't look too deep into this. I'm sorry I threw a ton of graphs at you. This is on the x-axis timber production, and we actually used the Center for Intensive Plantation silviculture models to project timber production based on the tree growth metrics. And then we compared that to these different metrics, and the red lines indicate a negative effect or a trade-off. So the more you produce timber, the less you produce native plant richness. Same thing for floral resources. The more you want to produce timber, the less you produce those floral resources for pollinators. Ungulate forage had a negative relationship. Culturally valued plants, pollinators, and birds all had a negative relationship. These other metrics, no relationship at all. So if you're interested in, pollination services or decomposition metrics or soil nutrients, not much of an effect of herbicides. Standing carbon, yes, we'd found a positive relationship, but that goes without saying. The more you produce trees, the more you produce carbon. So this is what I really focused on, was these wild ungulates. And so I'm glad that somebody asked a question about wild ungulates. And I wanted to test whether or not, after you spray herbicides, the effect of wild ungulates on that plant community became stronger because you were removing some of their forage species. So maybe they browsed your trees more. And in some cases, if you remove all their forage, are they going to concentrate their foraging and have a negative effect on other metrics? So these are pictures. On the left, you have where deer and elk are excluded. On the right, you have where they're allowed access. And this is that moderate treatment, or more of that industrial standard of treatment, site prep and follow-up herbaceous. And you see some of these bitter cherry plants outside, no bitter cherry plants. Fast forward a couple years, those bitter cherry are growing well above the Doug fir. And in this open, you have very little in the way of hardwood regeneration. And then boom, this is by year 6. This is in the exclosure, just dense maple and bitter cherry. In the open, primarily grasses and forbs. A lot of these herbivory tolerant species that can just regenerate rapidly after they get eaten. So overall, what we found is actually a positive effect of deer and elk on trees. Even though you can tell this tree was browsed, it didn't have a whole lot of forage early on. This is blackcap raspberry growing right next to this Douglas fir seedling. And even though this thing was browsed, probably repeatedly browsed, as you can see, it forks its leader a couple times, it was able to get above browse height at some point and above the competition. So the effect of deer and elk after you spray essentially helps trees to grow, which is counter to a lot of what folks think in terms of, well, you remove the forage, they're going to browse your trees more. That wasn't necessarily the case. So it was really interesting finding, and that had a negative effect on shrub biomass. And so these things, essentially, deer and elk acted like an herbicide in a lot of cases, helping to control the competing vegetation. So this is just a conceptual diagram that we had developed with the help of, this is a paper I co-authored on with AJ Kroll, James Johnston, Garrett Meggs, and we looked at all the different factors that could influence early seral habitat characteristics. And of course, herbicide applications, timber harvest intensity, whether it's clear cut versus the thinning operation, ungulate foraging, the climate for sure, where you're at in the landscape. Is it a more moist and productive site versus a drier, more moisture limited site? The sources of seeds, whether they were persistent in the seed bed or they come in via wind transportation or animal transport, and disturbance regime. Is it salvage logging operation, a timber harvest, or a severe fire event? So many factors govern how early seral habitat characteristics play out in terms of the diversity and productivity of these early seral habitats. And so one thing I haven't discussed is coarse wood. In terms of historic fire events, there would have been a lot more in the way of coarse wood habitat. So we just basically created this diagram. Down on the bottom, you have standing and down coarse wood, and on that y-axis, you have resources available to non-conifers. So up here, this is a clear cut without herbicides, a whole diverse variety of different shrub, forb, fern, grasses. Same thing here on the right, but in this case, you have coarse wood, and this is valuable for many different reasons. One, it can really put a hamper on your reforestation efforts. Immediately following a fire event, you have some of this fine slash that could end up creating more of a severe reburn. But there's a lot of value in these legacy dead trees for wildlife habitat, specifically a variety of different woodpecker species and other migratory secondary cavity nesting birds like bluebirds and house wren. But down here, we have, again, a clear cut that was sprayed, mostly conifers, not very diverse, and same thing here. But in this case, this was an area that was partially salvage logged and replanted. So you have that value of coarse wood, but you don't have the value of a diverse understory vegetation. So these aren't 4 discrete boxes. Really, it's a continuum in terms of how those early successional characteristics play out. And obviously, where you're at in the landscape really determines what these systems look like post disturbance. So getting finally down to Southwest Oregon, and I haven't done a ton of research down there, so I didn't want to focus too much on presenting things I'm not totally knowledgeable about. But this is overall departure of these systems from what they were historically. So the red and the orange being that the systems look, much different than the historic range of variability, or what these four systems would look like naturally. And the primary driving factor for these fire adapted systems is a lack of low severity frequent fire. So these are maps that were produced by my colleagues with the Nature Conservancy, Tom DeMeo, Ryan Haugo, and they're looking at restoration needs in different watersheds. And you can see in Southwest Oregon, there's a big need to restore these systems so that we can reduce reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. Adding on top of that with increasing drought, so longer drought here to the from left to right, increasing temperatures here bottom to top, drier conditions overall. We have basically the current climate shifting towards a future climate, and considerable amount of variability. There's a lot of uncertainty built into these models, but there is this mortality threshold, in which case we can assume that we're going to see certain species that aren't adapted to dry, warm, hot conditions starting to reduce in abundance, and maybe shifting in their range towards higher elevations, shifting from south slopes to maybe north slopes, from east to west. And so overall, it's a big concern, especially without that moderating frequent low severity fire. We have denser forests, and those denser forests, especially with drier, warmer conditions, are more primed to burn in severe events. So another photo and another diagram that was shared by Carrie Metland. This is looking at the overall, with climate change, how more frequent fires are going to be than compared to today. And all this yellow and orange indicates that fire is going to be way more frequent across the landscape, regardless of how we manage the forest. So thinking back to historic fire frequency, as I mentioned, in Southwest Oregon, been pretty frequent fire, whether it be lightning strikes or indigenous burning. And overall, that frequency used to be 5, 10, 20, 30 years every so often. Pretty frequently, fire would have been burning through, reducing the density of trees, creating more of that early successional vegetation intermixed with those fire adapted trees. So when we think about going forward, and I'm just, the restoration and getting these systems back to their more resilient to disturbances and more resilient to drought, we have to think about a whole variety of different things. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on managing forest land. And one of the main ways that we want to get systems back so where they can receive fire without burning catastrophically is to do some thinning. But we don't necessarily want to just do an even thinning where we have another simplified forest system, but clumpy thinning, in which case you have value for like cover for wildlife. You have openings, these red areas, openings where you have more forage production, and do it more in a variable way for when fire moves throughout this system. It's not going to burn evenly throughout the entire system. It could drop down to the ground here in these openings, might torch a few trees in these clumps, but that could add some value for like snags, for instance, for wildlife. So it's not just thinning, really want to do some follow-up with prescribed fire in many situations, because thinning alone, you have these coarse fuel loads. And if a fire burns right after a thinning operation during not ideal weather conditions, during extreme weather conditions, you could end up having a high intensity burn where you're going to lose these trees anyways. So following up and doing prescribed burning operations after thinning can really help to reduce the severity of fire. I say that, and this is an example. This was a prescribed burn unit that was thinned and then burned a couple years later. It came back all ASEAN with it. So just saying we're going to do thinning and burning and walking away from it isn't necessarily going to get us back to more of a resilient state. a fire burned through this ceanothus in the wrong conditions, you're still going to get a whole lot of mortality of these overstory trees because of the density of vegetation. As you mentioned, Max, it's not necessarily the early Seral itself, but the continuity of fuels here that is a concern. So follow-up treatments are often necessary, whether it's mowing, masticating, or following up with a prescribed burn operation. There's many resources available. Right now, private land prescribed fire isn't an option for many, but more and more as we're going forward, we have this idea of shared stewardship. We're sharing resources, sharing personnel, and all coming together to get more of this restoration across boundaries so that when fires do burn, they're going to burn at lower intensity. And also thinking about overall landscape composition is really important. Where you're at in the landscape, where you're at in the forest, is really going to determine what sorts of early successional species you want to try to manage for, as well as managing for these conifers. So it's really important to think about where you're at in the aspect slope, considering warmer, drier events, and talk to your extension forester. You can talk to Max and get his input on what you might want to do for your property, or feel free to reach out to me or folks with the TNC, folks with Forest Service, ODF. There's a whole variety of different mindsets on how to go forward with managing these systems in the face of climate change and severe fire, so that we can promote biodiversity, so we can promote forest health and overall our livelihoods. And so, in many cases, a lot of these restoration practices are quite successful. And this is, again, another photo that Carrie Metlin shared of oak savanna restoration, where it's like an oak pine restoration. And adaptive management is really critical to consider. And this adaptive management framework is essentially, instead of a more linear focus, more of a circular mindset of assessing where you're at in the landscape, assessing the forest conditions, laying out your management objectives, seeing what tools you have available. Sometimes that's sharing tools with your neighbors or resources with agencies, writing a clear management plan where you have obtainable objectives, implementing, determining whether your objectives were met. If they weren't met, making adjustments, following up with more monitoring, starting the cycle over again. It's really important to be really detailed in lining out your objectives for managing forest or understory vegetation, and being really mindful of, just taking notes, collecting data, and being adaptive, being flexible. Because, with fire and with warmer, more droughty conditions, we're going to have to get pretty creative and pretty adaptive when it comes to managing our forests in the future. So with that, I think I got just 2 minutes to spare. I want to thank you for having me. I'm sorry that I didn't focus enough on Southwest Oregon, but that's what I had for this early Seral talk.
Thank you, Thomas. Do you have time for a couple more questions?
I do.
Scott wants to know if you could explain why blueberry pollination did better under intensive herbicide.
So that wasn't that wasn't a great picture to show you actual measurable effects. We didn't have any differences in blueberry pollination. It just looked like there was a difference, but overall the error bars were really wide there. And so one of my crazy colleagues from Switzerland was like, oh, let's put some blueberry bushes out there in pots and expect them to be measurable. And that's just not the way it goes. We didn't have a great way to measure pollination. So that was a bit of a erroneous thing. So, but overall, we didn't find any difference in bumblebees. We did find lower species richness of pollinators, but overall bumblebees didn't differ. And one reason that is, even with the herbicides, you had a ton of these non-native forbs growing back, like hairy cat's ear and hawkweed, and those were great for pollinators. So we didn't find much difference in the bumblebees. Bumblebees are a major pollinator of blueberries, so it's potentially one reason we didn't find an effect.
Suzanne mentions, Elisa mentioned Suzanne Simard's Mother Tree Project, where she establishes that leaving the shrub and herbaceous layer did not affect commercial tree production versus using herbicides to reduce the shrub layer and promote tree growth. And she's wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I believe that a lot of her research was up in BC. I might be wrong, but that's a lot more of a moist environment compared to here. Moisture is the major limiting factor for getting trees to regenerate. And if you have a really dense regeneration of shrubs and you have droughty summers like we do, it's really hard to get trees to establish. And they might establish, but they're going to be pretty slow growing. And, you know, at least throughout all the studies I've seen in Oregon, it's pretty clear that some sort of vegetation management does get trees to grow more rapidly. If you're interested in growing trees for revenues, then it makes sense because you don't have to wait as long. But overall, you know, forests have been adapted to disturbances for a long time. So I get weary when people suggest that without vegetation management, it's never going to come back to a forest. In many cases, especially if there's some moisture available, over time, you're going to see those trees eventually get above the shrubs. It's just going to take a lot longer. There are legal constraints. If you're harvesting, ODF with the Oregon Forest Practices Act requires you to have you know, sufficient stocking of trees up to, I think it was 3 years to 3 to 5 years. It's about 200 trees per acre. So, you know, there's different methods. So it's not all just clear cut and spray and replant. There's a lot of different ways to regenerate trees, including natural regeneration. But, you know, I'm sure Max has a lot of insight into getting trees to grow in Southwest Oregon, but especially with how dry it is in a lot of areas, that competition is very limiting for trees. But yeah, in some cases they share some mycorrhizal associations. A lot of fungal species that are symbiotic fungi will actually, the shrubs will associate with the same ones the trees associate with. So I think that was a lot of the research she did, is finding that there was some mutual relationships going on. But that probably varies based on the forest type. And limiting factors, there's always that, the Lieberg's law of minimum, you know, what's the most limiting factor there.
Max notices that it looks like there's a linear relationship between intensive vegetation control and reduced early seral, but is there a sweet spot?
It's a great question, Max. And, you know, we had that light herbicide spray. It costs the same as our moderate in terms of the entries, in terms of the amount of money that goes into going through and spraying, but it was less of a hot mix, more of an herbaceous mix. And whenever I think about it, and this is just anecdotal, you don't need to spray the entire stand. In a lot of cases, if you know you're dealing with smaller acreage, you just really need to spray, you know, a few feet around the tree so that there's no competition within that crown space and within the root space of that tree. And so potentially you could also spray strips. You could do some thinning, like mastication treatments without spraying. But whenever I think about ungulate forage and I think about bird habitat, I kind of think, and there is some evidence that, you know, having dispersed amounts of shrubs throughout stand can provide enough resources to add value for wildlife habitat. And for the Coast Range, there was a few studies that looked at the threshold and that benefited birds, and it was only about 10% hardwood cover that had a really substantial increase in overall bird abundance and diversity. So with only 10% shrub cover, which is very little for an entire 40-acre, you know, stand, you don't need a whole lot of shrubs to have benefits to songbirds. So I think, you know, you can tailor your treatments to retain some early seral shrubs. And I probably should have talked a little bit more about that, but tailoring treatments to have some of that natural native plant diversity within your stand can be really beneficial for wildlife and for the functioning of that forest. And there, by no means do you need to have just an even, you know, monoculture spray type situation. And so some cases you might not need to use as much herbicide because you have high moisture and you get those trees to grow and have your shrubs. Maybe hotter, drier sites, you might need to just spray around those trees, and in the in-between, you can leave some of those shrubs.
Okay. Tom is wondering if the use of herbicides affects insects and if there's an impact on bird population.
Yeah, so we actually put up bird exclosures, which was crazy. We've netted half of our deer exclosures, and the birds, they eat a ton of insects. They eat, like, I think up to their body mass each day and insects. And so we didn't find a substantial, any sort of substantial decline in insect abundance, but certain insects were less abundant. And birds were probably the main driver of that. But overall, I don't know if our study was long enough duration to really get at, how that it could impact bird populations. But there were fewer birds, and it was mostly the broadleaf associated birds that weren't as abundant in those heavily sprayed areas. But as I mentioned, and you can look up Kroll, Kroll, AJ Kroll with Weyerhaeuser did a lot of research. Him and other researchers with Incasi did a lot of research that followed that up, and I think they're still collecting data. And early on, you didn't have much shrub biomass, and because they're using these habitats as nesting habitats, and those broadleaf associated species weren't really there. But as soon as you got some of that shrub regeneration after they stopped spraying herbicides, then those broadleaf associated species started to fill in. But no, we didn't notice any strong effect of herbicides on insects. So there's more of that nesting habitat that the herbicides affected.
I think this will be our last question. Ada asked a really great question on succession and climax communities. And she's wondering how do ecologists know what the final state of an area is?
Yeah, I think that's my question to everybody, is that we don't have a clear idea of what climax state would have looked like in the past because disturbances were so frequent. So climax assumes no disturbance. And that just isn't really a natural part of the landscape, because we have wind, we have drought, we have fire. So there's always some sort of disturbance that's setting the cycle back up, maybe even just a little bit. But when we talk about climax communities, we're talking about the infilling of some of these disturbance intolerant and shade tolerant trees, like your true fir species and your western hemlock type species that can grow in the understory, grow in those shading environments, and then end up replacing those early seral species like Doug fir. So western hemlock is a climax species. I don't know exactly what your climax species is down in Southwest Oregon. I assume you have a few, but it's more of that assuming no disturbance, you'll eventually get some species that dominate, that are intolerant to disturbance. And so, as far as knowing what the disturbance regimes were like, we're getting more and more data, looking at fire history through tree rings and fire scars. And even in more moist west side forests, we're finding even like the West Cascades and even parts of the Coast Range, there was fire. It didn't necessarily burn like it did in the Southwest Oregon or east slope of the Cascades, but there was still fire. They would have been keeping old growth Doug fir around. So those stands that are old growth Doug fir that persist sort of indicates that there was frequent enough disturbance to remove some of those climax species. Those are my thoughts on it. Can't be too sure because humans just don't think on the time scale that forests actually play out.
Well, thank you, Thomas. Thank you, everybody, for attending and your wonderful questions. That ends our presentation tonight.
Thank you, everybody. I look forward to visiting down there in Southwest Oregon someday soon.